Welcome, everybody, to Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Haig John, and I have Simon Senzon with us today, and I'm very excited to have him on our show. And we're gonna, talk about chiropractic, philosophy, history, life, whatever comes up. So, welcome, Simon Senzon. Thank you for being a guest.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
I was just writing a paper just recently about the decompressive forces in outer space and how important chiropractic is. And your research paper came up, and so I had to cite Simon Senzon on my paper. That was the biggest thrill of doing all of this, quite honestly. Can you
Oh,
tell us a
great.
little bit about what you've been? I mean, you've got a long history of writing and research. Why don't you maybe tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, I'm curious which paper, but we could get to that when we get rolling. Yes, I've been, I did a bachelor's degree in history way back once upon a time at SUNY Brockport, upstate New York. And my focus actually towards the end, they sort of let me do my own courses. I was able to create my own sort of self-study courses. So I ended up studying a lot of vitalistic philosophers, sort of a history of evolutionary concepts. I
Very
did sort
cool.
of a history of ideas. And then I moved on and did a master's degree in a similar program where I was able to kind of do my own thing. And I ended up writing a master's thesis in the 90s called Super Bike Man, which you'll like. It was a superhero on a mountain bike. This is 1993, so this is when mountain bikes were still new. Super Bike Man, Plato, and the Body, Mind, Soul, and it was just a philosophical dialogue, which was really fascinating. And it had I actually cited B.J. Palmer because I was in chiropractic care my whole life, and my chiropractor at the time, while I was working on my thesis, was he had BJ on the shelf, so I had Bigness of the Fellow Within, which blew my mind because I've been studying all these philosophers. I've been studying the
Yeah.
world's mystical traditions. And then I read BJ and I was like, wow, this guy is like right on. So it was
Cool.
a,
So that
yeah,
inspired you.
yeah, yeah, inspired me. So I ended up going to Sherman and then I started writing and started researching. I was really curious how the philosophy of chiropractic
Yeah.
was, how I could talk about it based on what I already knew in philosophy.
Mhm.
At the time, this is 1996. Fritjof Capra's book had just come out called The
Mhm.
Web of Life.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a history of 20th century theoretical biology.
Oh, wow.
And my mentor at the time, one of my mentors was Ralph Boone, who became head of research at Sherman for many years. And Ralph was just a brilliant, brilliant soul. And I said, Ralph, I'd like to write a paper combining Stevenson's text with Fritjof Capra, because it seems like a lot of the ideas are very similar because Capra was writing about what the biologists were philosophizing about what life is back in the 1920s and the 1930s,
Mhm.
which is when Stevenson's book came out. So Ralph, being the PhD chiropractor scholar that he was, he started the JVSR. Ralph, he was the first editor. He said, "Well, Simon, you got to go read all of Copra's references to make sure he was right, and then
Mm,
write your paper."
interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, so I started doing that, and then I started another project while I was there at school. Dr. David Koch, who just
Okay.
recently retired from life as the head of philosophy.
Mhm.
At the time, he was my philosophy instructor at Sherman, and he had just become president of Sherman. So I explained my project to him, and he was very interested. And he hired me as the special assistant to the president, as sort of a student intern program. So my job was to basically go read the green books, and I was searching for the use of the term organization. And this
Interesting.
was this was right when Rob Sinnott had released his CD where he scanned all of the green books
Hmm.
on 1990s scanner technology. I think he burned out 3 scanners, and he published a CD, a little CD-ROM on it was on Adobe 4.0, and
Yeah.
you had to unlock it. He gave you a key to unlock it so people couldn't pirate it. And then if your CD broke or whatever, or something happened, you had to call Rob to get the code. And it was cool.
Unlock my code.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I need my green books, man.
Dude.
So we started this really amazing project where I started searching the green books, and probably this was the very first digital research project of the
Mhm.
green books, because this was a new product, right? It had just come out, and I was searching for the term organization, because what Copper said was what the latest biologists were talking about in terms of systems theory, chaos theory, complexity science, that today's term self organizing systems was what those early biologists were writing about, but they were using the term organization.
Mhm.
So I thought, well, let's see if Stevenson and B.J. Palmer and the other authors of the Green Books were using the term organization in the same way those theoretical biologists were.
Yeah,
Because my thought was then we could demonstrate that the chiropractic theories of how the body is self healing and self organizing is not just some weird thing out of nowhere. It was actually congruent with the most leading edge thinkers of the time in
yeah,
biology. So that's how I got started, which was just an amazing thing. And my job was I would go sit with Dr. Koch every couple weeks
yeah.
and share with him my latest things I was learning. And we would just have like an hour or two discussion about philosophy and systems theory. And it was really quite
That's
a cool
fantastic.
thing. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
that's a good immersion from the beginning in chiropractic, right?
totally. Yeah, yeah,
And so, what inspired? What was your first book then that you published? How many do you have now? What?
yeah. Well, in our series of white books, we're right
Yeah.
now we're getting ready to publish volume 19,
Wow. I'm
which
writing
is
that down.
pretty cool considering the first one was published in 2004. So that's 18 volumes in 20 years, which is
Wow.
pretty
That's
cool.
like an Olympic athlete of the
Yeah.
mind right there. Wow.
Right. And I didn't write them all, of course. I wrote a good bit of them, but then I got the idea that there were you know, books that people were not aware of anymore. So I got permission to republish some chiropractic classics. I published some other authors.
Which are the
But the
classics
first
that,
book,
if you don't mind
uh-huh.
me interrupting, I apologize.
No, I
What
don't
were the
mind. Yeah.
classics that you republished?
Yeah, I republished. I started with the Drain books. Those are the ones that I started with. I mean, have you seen those? Jim Drain. He's got
No.
one called Chiropractic Thoughts, and then the other one I actually kind of invented a book of his. I took excerpts of some of his writings and put together a book called Mind and My Pencil. And then there's one more that
That's
I'm planning to
intriguing.
do down the road called Man Tomorrow. And Drain was amazing because he studied with BJ and like he graduated in 1911, I
Oh,
think,
wow.
and he was there when D.D. Palmer came to town and did his lectures in 1912.
That's
And Drain
incredible.
was in those classrooms. And then Drain went to every lyceum for the next 12 years. And then he bought the Texas Chiropractic College.
Mm,
So his book, Chiropractic Thoughts, came out in 1927,
yeah.
and it's very similar to Stevenson's text in terms of the ideas and the chapter titles, but it's written more for like the average student in Texas in the 1920s. Like it's
Very
written
cool.
really simply. Yeah, it's a very cool book.
But putting it in simple terms is, I think, one of the masterful arts to get it to the public and speak it on a fifth grade level or anything.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
talk about
yeah.
Texas Chiropractic. This is one of my books right here. Anything Can Cause Anything, William David Harper.
Right,
I love the obscure books, and this is
right. Yeah,
about DD, and I think this is a pretty good copy. Some of them are beat up out there, and they're hard to find.
yeah, yeah. That's a brilliant one. Is that the fourth edition from 1997? That's what it
Oh,
looks
let's
like,
look.
but it may not be. It
It
looks a
may
little shiny.
it's a little shiny, and
I
let
think
me
that's the
see.
shiny edition from 97 that they redid.
Oh, third edition, copyright
Oh,
1974.
oh, nice.
Oh,
So you've
yeah,
got
there's
one of his. He was still alive when that edition came out. That's very cool. Yeah.
so.
'Cause yeah. Well,
Well done.
Drain was Harper's mentor.
Oh, is
He
that
was
right?
yeah, yeah. He recruited Harper to the faculty. Harper was an engineer, and I guess he was a student, and then he recruited him to come back and teach, and then he sort of mentored him. So that's why you see the only green books that are cited in that book are the books that Drain was reading back in the day, right? It wasn't the newer BJ Green books because Harper wrote that book in the 50s and 60s. And what he did was when he wrote that, he studied D.D. Palmer's tome
Yeah.
for like 10 years. And
For
he
this book,
wanted
you're saying?
for that book, yeah.
Yeah.
And he wanted to update it and put it into modern neurophysiological terms. So that's what that book is. And that book actually had a pretty big impact on the profession. It's really a cool book.
Absolutely. And, that's where talking about our history is so important because, we talk about DD and BJ, but there are so many pioneers, amazing people that paved the path for us to where we are right now, just like you're talking about from Harper and from Drain. I mean, those are names that we should be spoken so much more in
Yeah.
chiropractic conversations.
Yeah, and that's why I did those started those classics. The other main one I did was the Ratledge books. So Drain, I actually was in touch with his granddaughter, and she sent me a box of materials. And in that were original manuscripts, his copy of the book that he had signed to his son, a whole photograph, like a whole photo album. So I was able to scan a lot of that and put that into the second book that I created. And then the other book was Routledge's books, which his student Paul Smalley published back in the 70s, mostly the 70s, the 80s. So I got in touch with Smalley's son and got permission to republish some of those. So I've done a couple of those books too, Routledge Philosophy One. And Routledge was a contemporary of D.D. Palmer. When
Hmm.
D.D. got out of prison for practicing medicine without a license in 1906, he spent 23 days in jail, and then he moved to Oklahoma. He signed over the school to BJ. They split the assets. He moved to Oklahoma, and that's when he met Routledge, who had just gotten his degree from Carver, who was D.D.'s lawyer, who actually learned chiropractic from another of D.D.'s students. So he was already a third generation chiropractor.
Yeah.
But he and Dee and their wives would go out to dinner when Dee was in Oklahoma, Routledge, and they would just hang out and,
Wow.
you know, become friends. And then Routledge opened a school in Southern California.
Hmm.
And when D.D. Palmer moved down there right after he published his 1910 book, he taught at Routledge's school. I think those last lectures that he had, which is his book, The Chiropractor, is about 21 lectures. We think those were his lectures that he taught at Routledge's school.
Hmm.
I think of Routledge as like the last of his students, you know?
That's such important stuff. I'm sitting here taking notes like I'm in class. I've got notes of
Nice.
what we're talking, like, oh, 1906, he was in jail. I was wondering what that date was.
Okay.
So, that's where getting to the, we have, thousands of listeners and, people that tune in from around the world, chiropractors from around the world for our Synapse Philosophy podcast. And, and this one as well. So students getting into our green books, absolutely important, but also getting into these, I don't want to call them obscure books because they should really be, on the shelf with green books. We are about to transition. We're at page, we have our podcast is tonight, 495 in the 1910 book right now. And it's,
You're getting there.
very few people have gotten, chipping away at it, chipping away at it.
Right.
It's very few people gotten this far in reading it, and they usually misquote that book feverishly. Okay.
Yeah, totally.
They'll
Yeah, yeah.
misquote usually what DD is trying to correct somebody, into true north.
Right. Yeah.
So they'll usually quote the wrong part. But now we got into this, we're into the innate section right here. And it's what I actually base my seminar on, is this section. And, in the 1914 book is when we talk about DD's philosophy of what we have basically not been given in school. It's a little bit, talking about spirit and innate and, universal and all those things are sort of blown to the side in every
Yeah.
school, every school. What do you think about that? How should that change? Do you think
Yeah.
there's possibility of that changing? What do you think?
Well, it's a good question. That brings us back to your other question you asked me about my first book.
Yeah.
So, I read that Bigness of the Fellow Within, and it really resonated with me. BJ Palmer's 1949 book, which is really a breakthrough for BJ. It was a whole new way of talking about the philosophy for him at that point. It was his first real textbook in a while, like philosophy book, and he wrote about innate intelligence in a whole new way. He started using the term "we" to describe himself instead of "I," to
Mm-hmm.
speak as innate and educated with one voice, and also to speak as everyone who was coming from the same perspective, the same truth with that voice, and sort of allowing the universal speaking through the innate and educated all as this "we." It was a big thing for him, and all of his books. His
I do it.
14. You
I
do?
listened to BJ, and I was like,
Yeah.
I'll do that too. Why not?
Yeah, right, right. I met a guy years ago. There was the guy who started the South Carolina Philosophy Forum. His name escapes me right now. Um,
Isn't
he
that Dwayne
he
Hoskins? No.
no, no, not this is way before Dwayne.
Okay.
And I can't think of it at the moment. I've got the book somewhere. Anyway, he said when he was in Michigan, he was getting his license at the Michigan board, and they said, "All right, son, you passed. Where are you going to practice?" And he said, "Oh, we're going to practice down, on this." And they said, "You've got an associate? What do you mean we?" He said, "Oh, me and Innate," or something like that. And that's just the way they spoke. Like BJ started a whole culture, of the philosophy was part of the culture. So I had studied, I was really interested in BJ's more esoteric writings. And
Mm-hmm.
I went to Sherman, and at Sherman, they did sort of a really important thing. It was really guided by Reggie Gold's insights, which was to sort of distinguish the difference in the philosophy between innate intelligence as the self-organizing, self-healing ability of the body, and that more esoteric spiritual stuff that you read in BJ and in DD, where they'll use the same term, innate intelligence, to talk about spirit, soul, all the spiritual stuff. So basically, what Reggie Gold did was he saw the writing on the wall, and he said, we're going to lose subluxation. They're gonna attack us, and they're attacking our philosophy. So let's sort of put all that spiritual stuff over here. Let's focus on subluxation because it's so important, and the body's ability to express its health and its wisdom intelligently, especially after you get adjusted. To sort of save the subluxation, we need to really focus on just that part of innate intelligence. So I got to Sherman and I got that message, but I was reading BJ and I was getting a whole different message from BJ, which resonated with everything that I'd been studying for years,
Mhm.
spiritual things. And one time I even had a faculty come up to me. I was in the student clinic reading one of BJ's later works. I think it was The Glory of Going On, which is one of my favorites. That's
Mhm.
where he tells the story of how he became we. I don't know if you've read that one. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this faculty was looking over my shoulder. He said, "Oh, you're reading one of those books." I went to Palmer. They taught us that's when BJ went crazy. Right? That's what he said
That's
to me.
great.
Yeah, so
That's
it was a
great.
real sort of like that kind of weird spiritual stuff. We don't need
Well,
that.
that's an important part of the timeline, though. That should be
Yeah,
known right there. That's
yeah,
important. So
yeah. I think it
now
is.
give me what year do you think that was? Where were we
When
when you said they
when
taught us that at Palmer? That you know,
Yeah, well, he was, he's still teaching at Sherman, so he was probably there in the '80s. I'd say in the
okay,
early '90s.
yeah, hmm,
Probably something like that. Probably the '80s, I'm guessing.
gotcha.
Which was a lot of people didn't understand BJ's later books. A lot of people didn't read them. They just, unfortunately, most chiropractors are not even aware. I've even heard Joe Strauss say, and one time he said, "I wish BJ stopped writing books after 1949."
Mhm.
And it was because of all that. He felt like that just muddied the philosophy, all that spiritual stuff. But I was like you. I decided to become a chiropractor when that chiropractor of mine who had BJ and Didi on the shelf
Mhm.
dragged me to Pasquale's Self Center. And I was sitting in the pews in Pasquale's, and people were saying things like I was first ordained as a chiropractor. And I was like, hey guys, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right. So that was like my like moment of okay, I'm gonna do this, which is so in my first book, I actually decided that paper was coming out that I had been working on. I graduated in September '99, and that paper was in press at the JVSR. Ralph Boone, as the editor, was edited it, and we got that published. And then I decided I had some time before I had licenses and my boards were all passed, and I was able to open a practice. So I enrolled in a PhD program out in California. This transpersonal humanistic psychology program with but not to be a psychologist, but they had sort of a consciousness studies piece to it.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
wanted to initially do a thesis on B.J. Palmer's spiritual writings. I wanted to be able to really differentiate for people the difference in his definitions and Didi's definitions of innate to
Mhm.
say, well, really, they're talking about at least two different things using the same words, which is
Mhm.
confusing. So let's see, how can we not throw the baby out with the bathwater and acknowledge the truth of what they're saying here while also acknowledging this other part that's totally valid, and how can we talk about all of that.
Yeah.
And part of it was inspired by that movement at Sherman, which was all right, let's protect and defend subluxation so it's not thrown out. And I realized that even if we do that, and which was this was the movement in the '90s, just what you're talking about, to really kind of kind of like sweep under the rug all
Yeah.
that weird spiritual stuff.
Mhm.
I said, we could do this all day long and talk about the science of subluxation and the science of the body's innate ability to heal and all the new science that's coming out about all of this. But all the detractors have to do is crack DD open or crack BJ open and say,
Mhm.
isn't that subluxation related to all this stuff? And
Mhm.
if we didn't have a solid academic philosophical way to address that critique,
So important.
we left ourselves wide open. So that's
Yeah.
kind of what I've been doing for like 25 years, really.
Well, you've been prolific at it, which is great because we need it. And that your statement that you just said of how important that is, because I hear innate intelligence on TV commercials on YouTube. It's everywhere's everyone's using these terms. How are they using it? Are they using it properly? Chiropractors haven't been able to hold on to that as our own lexicon. So you know, how do we get in this confusion of now everybody's innate driven? And your innate everything, right? Your innate toilet paper, who knows? But everything is, innate driven. We see around us. Do you think chiropractors have dropped the ball, or really that's us getting the momentum for the future? that we've created already from the people that have come before us.
Yeah, well, I think we've been planting these seeds in the culture for a long time. If you think about it, BJ Palmer bought the largest radio station west of the Mississippi back in the 1920s,
Yeah.
and really grew it in the 30s, and there was no interference is a good word in the atmosphere for the radio waves, so people were hearing BJ's lectures on their radios as far away as Alaska,
Wow.
Hawaii. They
Mhm.
had maps at Palmer where people would write in letters of where they heard the show, because it would
Incredible.
just travel around the globe and people would pick it up in their radios. So all the United States was actually being immersed in Palmer chiropractic philosophy on their radios for decades, back in the day.
I mean, that's incredible. I bought off you eBay once. There's like four audio of, I guess, sort of plugs of BJ Palmer from the radio. His radio reads is what you call it. So I love those. I wish I had more of them. I play them in the office like all the time and just kind of like play them on a loop.
That's cool. That's
Yeah, it's
really
a lot
cool.
of fun.
So
So
I think, yeah, I mean, we did drop the ball, I think, but I think, there's so many seeds out there now that it's ripe, for us to really take ownership and teach people and make some change.
if you hear my dogs barking in the background, you know that my wife just got home.
Nice.
So, I think it's really amazing. And I think that's even more one of the reasons I even named, the seminar as innate adjusting and using innate is because from what I've heard from the old guys, the people that came before us, and I think it was Sigafus, maybe it was interviewing Herbert Ross Reaver, and they was asking, why you're, however old he was, maybe in his 90s, why are you still adjusting people? And he said, because every day I have an opportunity to teach people about innate, not about a subluxation, but about innate. Our education system has changed from that, right? And so, how powerful, if we educating people to how powerful they are, that's what that education was really. There's something greater than this earthly thing. There is innate intelligence in you, and that is a part of something even bigger. Whoa, who is teaching that? It was
Yeah.
chiropractors from the beginning.
Totally. Yeah, I just had a new patient right before our little meeting here, and it was amazing to me to just see the light go on in her eyes when she came in, and she was like, "So are you going to give me exercises on how to move and what to do?" And I said, "Well, I would really like to see how your body's going to want to move and respond after the adjustment, because your
Mhm.
body knows what it needs to do." And this light went on, and she said, "I really like that. That makes sense." And just those,
Yeah,
sometimes it's that simple,
sure.
to plant those seeds.
Well, you planted a seed, but what you really did was break a barrier.
Right, right.
And you're giving people somebody, listen, you are amazing. There's amazingness in you. Every molecule in your body is amazing. And when we start coming from that consciousness, there's no stopping people. And we see them not only heal from maladies but emotional, physical, their lives change. They see it the world in a brighter way. That is truly amazing. For me, I got a lot of that when I started in chiropractic. I started at, I was at Life University, and Arnaud Bernier, he asked me to be on his staff for MLS, and just sitting and talking about the amazingness of just this vessel we're in, and reading Didi's book, and getting into his wisdom, getting into the writings that you have, and then some of the history of him, of just getting to understand that some of this is this is a textbook for students. We're teaching them also about, for the first time, reading about innate intelligence. And you have people putting it in words for the first time, really talking. And we've talked this about on my podcast. They were talking in quantum physics before quantum physics was anything. They were making up new language. Stevenson making up new language to describe what we were, chiropractic philosophy was. And it's amazing seeing the correlations between Stevenson's writing and D.D. Palmer. That is, as we're reading it and breaking it down, we could see the similarities where Stevenson has gotten this from D.D. in his writings. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm working on a series of courses right now for my institute, TIC, where I'm doing a history of innate intelligence in chiropractic. So just how the idea changed and evolved over time. What were D.D. Palmer's initial ideas about it when he first wrote about it? How did that change? Because when you look at that, it might even be that chapter that you're looking at right now on innate, where he had an earlier essay in his 1906 book called Innate Intelligence. And in the 1910 book, he takes that actual essay and critiques himself and expands on his own concepts. So you
Is
can
that,
actually,
I didn't mean
yeah,
to cut you off. I
that's
haven't
okay.
gotten to that part yet. I really
Yeah.
want to look at that. Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to look at what page numbers to send you to, but yeah, so that's that's the kind of thing we did a book a few years ago, the definitive guide to the green books.
That's a
So I
great.
really had the opportunity to go into them and trace how the ideas changed, and that was one of the big eye openers for me. That he was actually just like he was telling other chiropractors, "No, you're wrong." He was looking back at his own ideas from a few years ago and saying, let's expand on this here. He didn't quite say where he was wrong, I don't think, but he definitely expanded quite a bit, which is really cool to see.
But it makes me respect the man even more
Sure.
because at the time, we've said it over and over again. He was probably one of the most learned men in human physiology, absolutely certainly for the spine and the vertebral column of the time. Would you
Yeah, I
agree?
would agree. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Simon, I want you to, what's the website for Tick
Yeah, institutecairo.com.
Institute? We'll make sure we put it in there and I'll get that from you before, okay?
Yeah,
Before
for
we end.
sure. Yeah,
InstituteCairo.com. Thank you for
yeah,
that. Now,
sure.
you mentioned 1906. Now, I have on here, I was going to mention to you about 1906. And because of the controversy of, I've heard the stories, there's stories of DD saying, it's not ready to publish yet, and BJ publishing his book. Then did BJ put his name on there and call it his book? Or what's the history around that? Am I
Sure. Yeah, yeah. No, it's a really good topic. It's pretty our research on it is pretty new, really. Until just the last few years, that's never really been clear. But
Mhm.
now it's pretty clear what happened. Um, when DD and BJ, when they got back together, they split around 1902. DD moved to California, opened a school in Santa Barbara, and then he made his way back east and he was going to open a school in Chicago. And a lot of this is documented in Tim Faulkner's book that we published. It's called The Chiropractor's Protege, which is really cool. O.G. Smith, who was DD's student for about 6 years from 1898 to 1904, he followed him to California and was faculty at the school. Smith kept a journal, and Tim Faulkner found all these journals in Smith's grandson's garage.
Wow,
So
cool.
that's where that book emerged from. And we've got another book coming out that's going to blow you away after that, but we could talk about that next. But so OG Smith and Dee Dee were out in California. That's when he met Menora Paxson. She graduated there, and she was a nurse midwife, and then became a chiropractor. And the three of them moved to Chicago to open a school in Chicago, and it sort of fell through. Dee Dee didn't want to get arrested again, so he split, and they were kind of done with Dee Dee for whatever reason. They all kind of clashed at that point. So they went and worked with Langworthy at his new school. And Dee went back to where BJ was, and BJ had been running the school now by himself for a couple years. And then Langworthy, who was their main competitor at this point, he was one of Dee students from 1902. He was publishing his own journal every month with articles. He had advertisers from all over the country, and he wasn't breaking any real new ground in chiropractic, but he was stealing some of Didi's stuff and putting it in there, putting it in his other things he was writing. So Didi felt some pressure because Langworthy wasn't telling anybody who invented chiropractic. He was kind of like, yeah, he's the one who kind of made up that DD stole it from some bohemians. Like there was no Google back then, right? So people couldn't say who invented this thing, right?
Right.
So there was some real fighting. And then Smith, who had this falling out with Didi, he got on the bandwagon with Langworthy, and they were trying to sort of push Didi out. So that's when Didi really started writing. So they started their new journal at the end of 1904, The Chiropractor, and Didi started publishing articles every month from all the way through 1904 into the spring of 1906 when he gets arrested. And he got arrested because of that journal, because he published in there, I can cure stuff, basically. And the laws in Iowa didn't allow for that kind of statement. So that's why they brought him up on charges. But in the December or the January issue of 1906, they announced that the book was coming. They had a 200-page book called The Science of Chiropractic. And it was basically all of these articles Didi had been writing every month. They were putting them together and they were going to publish them as a book.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in the works. They had the manuscript going, and it was happening. And then he gets arrested, and there were these charges that were already out there. He goes to jail. They split up, and then BJ had the school on his own. So he just went ahead and decided to keep going with the book. So he wrote his own stuff. He brought in some other authors to write some chapters. He threw in some sections from the osteopathic journals that the osteopaths were writing. So he expanded this 200-page thing to like a 400-page
Mhm.
thing, and then published it in really summer. By the fall, he published it. So Dee had only been gone for a few months. So the book was already in the works. It was mostly Dee. Both of their names were on the cover, and you can't see they didn't put each other's names under the articles or the chapters, so it's hard to know if you don't know like his writing or what he was already doing, which is Dd's, which is BJ's. And one of the projects I'm planning to do in the future is to because I actually started a spreadsheet on that a few years
Oh wow,
ago,
that's fabulous.
to see if I could recreate what his original book was that he
Mhm.
wanted, and we'll call it something like, Dd's maybe first volume or something.
Well, that's the biggest question. That
Yeah,
was actually my next question. What parts BJ? What parts Didi?
yeah,
Where did it
yeah,
come
yeah,
from? I know there are some statements in the beginning where they're just epigrams type of thing, but to me they look much more like Didi Palmer than they do BJ Palmer.
yeah, yeah,
And it's one of the books that I've for way I haven't read the whole book yet, and I've kind of been saving it for our next one after we finish 1910 for our podcast. But we take breaks in this every once in a while to go through all 1,000+ pages. We do chunks at a time. But
yeah.
I figured the way I looked at it, it was the beginning is a lot of Didi, and then BJ is a lot at the end, or is it mixed all through?
Yeah, well, BJ, he actually hired a professor at a local college
Oh,
to help him organize it. So it's
okay.
actually organized roughly by topics,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's just kind of mixed.
It's all
So
mixed together.
that's why I started the spreadsheet. So one of the things I was able to do was to look at each of the chapters or essays in there, and then compare them to earlier writings that we have that we know Dd wrote. So that's where in my spreadsheet I could sort all that out and start to see which chapters were definitely his. And then once we get through these next two books with Tim and Joe, my co-authors, they're going to sit down with me. So we'll sort of have a peer review where we all agree
Mhm.
that these were the Dd chapters, and then we'll put that book out maybe as like volume 22 of the white books or something.
That's
But
exciting.
yeah, it's cool. But our new book, you're gonna love this. It's Tim, as part of his research on O.G. Smith, he started researching all of the early students of D.D. Palmer.
Mhm.
So we have a new book coming out this spring. We're hoping to finish it over the next month or so. It's about 25 chapters, and they're pretty short, and it's on D.D. Palmer's first 23 students.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. I always think about that first class. What would
Right.
it be like to be sitting front row in Dee Dee's first class?
Yeah, right. And that's what it was. It wasn't just for some people, it was just a couple weeks of just following him around, listening to him. And, if you already knew stuff, like you were an osteopath or an MD, he didn't require you initially to stay very long. He just taught you the basics
Mm-hmm.
and moved on. And then he's developed some diplomas that said you're competent to practice and teach. So then people started opening their own schools, and some of them started stealing his stuff. But a few things that we're finding are really fascinating are many of them were already osteopaths or MDs or became osteopaths or MDs. None of the ones who were osteopaths they all say that what Didi was teaching was unique, right? So, because there was always a sort of controversy because osteopathy started around the same time in the Midwest, and the osteopaths always accused Didi of
Always.
stealing. And so it's some interesting stuff. But one thing we found is many of these guys went and taught at
Mhm.
osteopathic schools after they learned from Didi.
Mm.
So it looks like Didi may have influenced early osteopathy in ways that nobody ever imagined.
I didn't ever put that together. It seems so logical. And that is really interesting. I can't wait to see that book. That is mind blowing stuff. That
Yeah,
is
yeah,
exciting.
yeah. Yeah, that's the really that one's mind blowing. And then the next one after that is gonna be so Tim, he found that box in OG Smith's garage, OG Smith's grandson. And Smith had kept meticulous notes of everything he purchased in his journal. He kept receipts.
Cool.
And Tim noticed that Smith bought four journals and he only accounted for three. So he went back to Texas. He asked the grandson, "Can I come have a look one more time to see if we missed anything?" And there was this notebook tucked behind a cabinet. He pulls it out, and it's written on the front, Chiropractic, copyright 1899 by O.G. Smith. and it's a handwritten book of the notes from D.D. Palmer's classroom in 1898.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
It's so cool. So we wanted to do this first book on his first students, and then we're going to follow up with that book on what he was actually teaching. So some big stuff coming out
That's
about
big
DD.
stuff. And it's so necessary and it's so amazing getting into what we're doing as chiropractors. That's what, we try and instill in all young chiropractors and the old is you got to get into this and understand it. It's the passion comes from this amazingness. And when reading like 1914, I could almost feel like Dee you've got to take care of the people. It is that important. They need chiropractic. It's like I feel like he's the cheerleader in some of this stuff. That you get understand what you have is so huge. Go out
Yeah,
and serve the people. The denizens of the earth deserve it. And
yeah,
so how many people use denizens now? But I get it from BD Palmer, right?
totally, man.
Well,
I can hear it.
Simon, that's it.
Yeah,
Simon, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here. I had a blast hanging out with you. And, let's do it again soon because
sure,
this
man.
is fun, right?
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, happy to do it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm going to plug my podcast. It's Synapse Philosophy Podcast. We do it Tuesday nights live. Anybody can join in, and everybody's welcome to share. And we do repost them right afterwards. And we're halfway through D.D. Palmer's 1910 book, The Chiropractor's Adjuster, and we're on page 495. And February 1st, I'll be at Sherman College of Chiropractic teaching innate newborn adjusting. And we started the way D.D. Palmer did. We taught the science, the philosophy, and the art. So I really appreciate your time again. Thank you very much, Simon Senzon. And hey, I had a blast hanging out with you, and I can't wait to see these new books and read some more of the old ones.
Yeah, man. Happy to be here. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.